that bicarb and hydrogen ion as the principal extracellular buffers. So a buffer is something that's either going to donate hydrogen or accept hydrogen. And I'm assuming that you all know what strong acid versus a strong weak acid and strong base acid, strong weak base are. So protein, the buffers besides hydrogen and bicarb, things that can attach hydrogen to them, like the proteins in your circulatory system, those buffer hydrogen ion. They also can attach base as well and buffer base. So in addition to hydrogen that will buffer bicarb and bicarb that will buffer the hydrogen ion, you have a lot of proteins in your blood system that can bind these hydrogens and bicarb. However, that's going to alter the tertiary structure of your protein if there's too much of that attachment going on. So you can run the risk of decreasing the function of those proteins. Hemoglobin is another protein that can bind the sort of buffer, and then your phosphate system. Some of this is going to be used in the blood, and some of it's also going to be used in the kidneys. The main thing is you have carbonic anhydrase in the red blood cell that can convert CO2 to bicarbon hydrogen ion and then bind hydrogen to the hemoglobin, pass bicarb out into the bloodstream. You have other proteins like albumin and your globulins that can bind the hydrogen and bicarb, and then phosphates as well in the system. In the kidneys, you're going to have carbonic anhydrase again. You're going to take the CO2 from the blood and convert it to hydrogen ion and bicarb, and then handle it in different ways depending on do you want to help to compensate for a respiratory acidosis or alkalosis, or do you have to compensate for a metabolic acidosis or alkalosis. And so you might be wanting to put hydrogen back into the blood, or you might be wanting to put bicarb back into the blood. You might want to get rid of hydrogen ion. So how do you get rid of hydrogen ion when carbonic anhydrase is present in the kidney? You can put it out into the lumen and bind it to phosphate that's been filtered. And then it can't be broken down again by carbonic anhydrase and recycled. So we've got urinary systems that use phosphate. We don't filter proteins, so can't use that there. Don't filter the hemoglobin, can't use it there. So we're relying primarily on the phosphates, and then we can also make some ammonium molecules in the cell and then secrete those. So we have, what we're trying to do is to have mechanisms that can handle the hydrogen ion or the bicarb that builds up in the plasma and is shifting your pH to the point where it might get out of the physiologic range. Remember, 7.35 to 7.45 is the narrow range of healthy pH. We can have a ventilatory, we can have a respiratory acidosis, metabolic acidosis, or the same for alkalosis. We can have a normal we can have normal ventilatory rate and yet have a high acidosis because we have metabolic processes that are producing the hydrogen ion. And we could also, so hydrogen ion is going to be high. The respiratory system is going to try to compensate for the metabolic acidosis by increasing respiratory rate and blowing out more CO2. Getting rid of CO2 via the reversible reaction then gets rid of hydrogen ion. In metabolic alkalosis, you want to conserve hydrogen ion. So reduce respiratory rate, keep CO2 in, drive the equation the other direction and make more hydrogen ion to balance the excess bicarb in the system. So in a metabolic acidosis, respiratory rate goes up. In a metabolic alkalosis, you want to conserve the CO2, so the respiratory rate will go down. The rate of hydrogen to CO2 conversion in the respiratory acidosis, you have a decrease in that conversion. So you're blowing out the CO2, so you're not converting the CO2 back to hydrogen ion, and hydrogen ion is still getting combined with bicarb to form CO2 at the lungs, and you're exhaling it. The metabolic alkalosis, you reduce the respiratory rate, so alveolar CO2 builds up. There's less CO2 leaving the blood, so now carbonic anhydrase can work on the CO2, combine it with the bicarb, and generate hydrogen ion to compensate for the metabolic alkalosis. It turns out the respiratory system only can handle about, or compensate about 50 to 75%, can't totally correct for a metabolic alkalosis or acidosis. And it's because the central chemoreceptors and the peripheral chemoreceptors are kind of at odds with each other. That's what your book says. So initially, peripheral chemoreceptors see the high CO2 in a metabolic acidosis first. They increase respiratory rate and you blow out CO2. But when the blood is decreased in CO2 concentration, when the blood gets to your central chemoreceptors, and their carbonic anhydrase takes that low CO2, converting it to hydrogen ion. As far as your central chemoreceptors are concerned, CO2 is too low. So they're going to send out messages to decrease the respiratory rate. So peripheral chemoreceptors increase respiratory rate, but as you lose the CO2, then the brain says, not enough CO2, so dampen the respiratory rate. So you're cycling on and off, up and down with the respiratory rate. Hyperventilation, hypoventilation, hyperventilation, hypoventilation. So you never get complete compensation for the metabolic acidosis. Same thing for alkalosis. So that's the little note here. So what do? You want to get back to the normal pH range, and so you have the kidneys to help out. So the kidneys and their specific cells will then try and do the rest of the compensation. So the other 50 to 25%, you have to wait for the kidneys to kick in. And that may take several days, it may take a week or so for the kidneys to start to help out. We've got two types of cells in these collecting tubules and the outer medullary collecting ducts. They're called intercalated cells, which just means their plasma membranes, their lateral plasma membranes are interdigitating with each other. The A cell is going to handle the acids for you. You've got the carbonic anhydrase that's out in the tubular lumen, it's going to, if you have filtered bicarb, the A cells will be secreting hydrogen ion, and that's active transport of hydrogen out into the lumen. It combines with the bicarb, forms carbonic acid, and then disassociates into CO2 and water. Both of these then have a gradient to enter the A cell. There's carbonic anhydrase in the A cell as well. It's going to take the water and break that apart and into hydrogen ion and OH. The CO2 that's diffusing in from the blood will combine with the OH, reform the bicarb inside the cell, and then you have a transporter and exchange antiport here that will put the bicarb back out into the blood. Bicarb cannot be absorbed or reabsorbed apically. So there's no transporters in the kidney to get that bicarb into the cell. So you've got to convert it to CO2 and water, which then can diffuse across the plasma membrane and make the bicarb again inside the cell. Then there is a transporter to get rid of the bicarb in exchange for chloride. Chloride coming in will be either diffusing out into the lumen here, or it will be being put back out into the interstitium. So what you're doing is reclaiming the filtered bicarb. It is a one-for-one movement of bicarb. You're taking the bicarb apart, reassembling it in the cell, and then putting it out into the interstitium, which then will diffuse back into the blood. So this hydrogen ion that's being pumped out is essentially being recycled, because when water comes back into the cell, it's going to be broken down into hydrogen and OH and then re-pumped out. So it's just kind of spinning around. It's helping to get the bicarb back into the intercalated cell and then into the blood. So when you have an acidosis, you want to reclaim the filtered bicarb. You can't afford to let it go because you need it back in the blood to counteract the hydrogen ion that's accumulating out in the bloodstream and causing the acidosis. The B cells are going to, these do have bicarb exchange protein in the apical plasma membrane. What the B cells are doing during a metabolic alkalosis is taking the bicarb that they're making a bicarb in the cell. CO2 diffuses in, carbonic anhydrase is going to combine CO2 and OH and form the bicarb, and then the bicarb is going to be exchanged for something. There's various kinds of exchanges in the apical plasma membrane. This bicarb cannot be reabsorbed, so it's going to go out in the urine. So essentially, you are decreasing the blood of a bicarb by taking CO2 and making a bicarb and putting it out into the bloodstream. You're not losing the CO2, you're not losing any acid, because the hydrogen is going to be secreted back into the blood. So during a metabolic alkalosis, the CO2 is used to make bicarb that's then gotten rid of, and hydrogen ion is pumped back into the blood to help to compensate for a metabolic alkalosis. And that's done in type B intercalated cell. So type A they're going to operate when there's an acidosis. They're going to reclaim filtered bicarb, put it back into the blood that it was filtered out of. In a metabolic alkalosis, you're wanting to get rid of bicarb. And you can filter bicarb, but you can also take CO2 and convert it to bicarb and get rid of bicarb that way. Recycle hydrogen ion, which then helps to compensate for that alkalosis by acidifying the blood. Another way to help with compensating for an acidosis is where you have hydrogen ion that is, well, CO2 coming into the cell, combining with the OH from water, forming bicarb, and putting bicarb out into the blood. So you're taking a CO2 from the blood and turning it into bicarb and putting the bicarb back into the blood. So you are depleting the hydrogen, adding to the bicarb population. They refer to this as new bicarb because it's not a reclaimed bicarb that's been filtered. It's a whole brand new bicarb that's being made out of a CO2. So since the CO2 is essentially hydrogen ion, hydrogen ion goes down, bicarb goes up, helps to compensate for the acidosis. The hydrogen that is from the water is pumped out into the lumen. Filtered phosphates are going to then find the hydrogen, and it won't be able to disassociate from the phosphate, and that's going to go out in the urine. Yes? This is an acidosis because you're reclaiming bicarb. You're making new bicarb and putting it into the blood. You wouldn't be putting bicarb into the blood, hopefully. You wouldn't be doing that if you have an alkalosis. You'd be trying to get rid of the bicarb. So by putting new bicarb into the blood, taking CO2 and making it into bicarb, depleting the blood of CO2, putting bicarb in, you're helping to correct for an acidosis. And then the hydrogen is going out into the lumen, binding to the phosphate, not being able to get off of that phosphate. It's going to go out into the urine. So you are buffering the hydrogen in the tubular lumen by binding it to the phosphate. Another thing that your book mentions but doesn't have on a figure is that you can take ammonia and combine hydrogen with it and make ammonium, and then secrete ammonium into the tubular lumen, and it goes out into the urine as well. So you have two additional ways to get rid of hydrogen. It's by binding it to the filtered phosphate, or breaking down amino acids in the cell, and then getting the ammonia to bind with ammonia, hydrogen ion to make ammonium, and then putting that into the tubular fluid. So two additional hydrogens now are going out. So you've got these mechanisms to handle the acidosis. If you remember the ratio, your book also mentions this again, the ratio of hydrogen to bicarb, 1 hydrogen for every 600,000 bicarbs. So perturbations, changes in hydrogen numbers, you got to handle that very quickly, because you lose 1 hydrogen, you gain 600,000 bicarb, and that's going to send you into alkalosis. But if you're in an acidosis, if those hydrogen ions are going up, you're losing 600,000 bicarbs for every 1 increase in hydrogen ion. So it's important to get rid of those hydrogen ions as quickly as possible. So there's these 3 mechanisms for getting rid of hydrogen ion. Respiratory acidosis. Respiratory acidosis means this acidosis is caused by your respiratory system. Metabolic acidosis is caused by a metabolic problem inside the body, so cellular metabolism. Respiratory acidosis is due to hypoventilation. You are not breathing adequately to get rid of the CO2, so the CO2 builds up, drives the equation towards hydrogen ion and bicarb. Every increase in 1 hydrogen ion, you've lost 600,000 bicarbs in their effect in balancing the pH. So you have respiratory acidosis developing relatively quickly because of that. Lung disease. So you've got emphysema. You've got some type of lung disease. Could be a temporary lung disease like pneumonia. So you've got bacterial infection, viral infection down there, and pneumonia. The fluids build up. You have an increased barrier for gases to diffuse. Even though CO2 is very diffusible in the fluids, it's got a harder time now getting out of your alveoli and into the environment. So it tends to build up in your blood and cause an acidosis. If you take certain medication, then that can suppress your central nervous system, your respiratory centers, and respiratory rate goes down. Certain diseases like asthma, chronic asthma will cause this as well. The disorders that reduce respiratory activity. You got nervous system diseases, muscular diseases. If you got a muscular wasting disease, then your respiratory muscles can't inflate and get the same volume in and out for each breath. So you have respiratory acidosis developing. If you, as I mentioned, the little kids say, oh, my breath and die because you won't buy me that. Well, they're going to develop a temporary respiratory acidosis that usually is going to cause them to pass out. They'll start to breathe again, and everything will be fine. They'll wake up and they'll go, oh my God, what was that? And usually it cures them of that kind of behavior. But some people voluntarily hold their breath. Maybe they're chasing that fish down there and they have to hold their breath because the fish is getting away from them. Temporarily, you're getting a respiratory acidosis developing. Once you get back up and breathing in, it goes away. Compensations for respiratory acidosis. If it's caused by a medication, find out what the medication is, get them off that medication, correct the problem. The body will, if it's a disease process, you can't do much. The body will try and use its buffer system to increase bicarb by reclaiming any filtered bicarb, make new bicarb in the kidney, get it out into the bloodstream, and then bind any hydrogen ion that it can get into the tubular lumen and then out eventually into the urine. The kidneys can secrete this excess hydrogen ion. It's going to take them a while to kick in. They don't turn on just for a temporary respiratory acidosis. They're going to wait and see. I am not sure if they're really waiting to see, but eventually, 2-3 days, they will start to help with the compensation. So excrete excess hydrogen ion, reclaim any filtered bicarb, make new bicarb and put it back into the blood, and that's the compensation for a respiratory acidosis.
Is there a certain name for that cell that does the produces the new bicarb?
Yeah.
There's like an A and a C.
So the new bicarb it's a principal cell. It's not the A and B cell, it's the principal cell. Respiratory alkalosis is caused by hyperventilation. So you're blowing out too much CO2. Could be a temporary thing. You're just really, really nervous and hyperventilating. Sometimes the treatment for that is rebreathe your own exhaled air. So put a paper bag there, go in and out of a paper bag. You're rebreathing your CO2, and that will correct for your respiratory alkalosis. It happens when you have a fever, your metabolic rate goes up, your respiratory rate goes up. Aspirin, taking too much aspirin. Some people with inflammatory diseases treat the inflammation with aspirin, but as they're doing that, maybe their kidneys aren't getting rid of all the aspirin that's coming in these high doses, and so it starts to build up in their system, and that will cause hyperventilation to try and get rid of the byproducts of the acid. Also, going to altitude, you have a decreased concentration of oxygen in the air at altitude, and so you see less O2 coming into the blood. The brainstem is going to increase ventilatory rate to try and get more O2 into the alveoli and into the blood. However, being that CO2 is more diffusible than O2, you're losing a lot of CO2 by trying to gain the O2. So the response to the low oxygen partial pressure at altitude is hyperventilation. Compensations, you want to get hydrogen off any protein that it's bound to, get it back into the free form so that it can start to bind with the bicarb. And you want the kidneys to conserve the hydrogen ion and put it back into the blood and get rid of excess bicarb. And then some facts about metabolic acidosis. You have severe diarrhea, maybe cholera, maybe something else that is causing you to have watery stools coming out at a high rate. You're losing the bicarb from your duodenum in that process. It has to be remade, so the building blocks for a new bicarb come out of the blood that leaves acid behind. So you develop a metabolic acidosis due to the diarrhea. If you exercise a lot, you have a lactic acidosis, and that is a metabolic acidosis. Uremic acidosis is due to excess muscle and nucleic acid catabolism. So maybe a disease is causing it. Could be very, very strenuous exercise when you're ripping your muscle cells apart. The kidneys can't get rid of all that uric acid and urea, and so it builds up in the blood, and it usually has to be handled by either the intraperitoneal dialysis or the regular type of dialysis. Also, consuming a high-protein diet can cause a metabolic acidosis because the meat and the proteins that you're eating are broken down to urea, and the cells, if you're eating the cellular proteins, then the nucleic acids are converted to uric acid. These build up in your system, and exceed what the kidneys can get rid of. You have to have dialysis to compensate for the uremic acidosis. Also, just if your kidneys are failing, then you'll get without lactic acidosis, without excess protein in your diet or muscle catabolism. Compensations for the metabolic acidosis are going to be get rid of that hydrogen ion, and that will be primarily first off by hyperventilation. Get rid of the CO2, you get rid of the hydrogen ion. And that's only going to compensate about 50 to 75%. If you're in good shape, then the kidneys have to take over. And they'll get rid of the excess hydrogen and then take CO2, make new bicarb out of it, and put it back into the blood. Okay. The metabolic acidosis, you lost bicarb below the pyloric sphincter. Now you're losing acid from above the pyloric sphincter. So you're vomiting out the hydrochloric acid from your stomach. You got to remake that acid. So you take the acid from the blood that leaves bicarb behind in the blood. Now you've got an alkalosis that is metabolic in its origin. So the other thing is you got gastric acid reflux, you got some little irritation in your stomach, and you start eating Tums. And some people, they'll sit there with a bottle of Tums, and they'll just be eating a Tum like every 15 minutes or so. They just eat it, taking Pepto-Bismol. All of those things are there to help you to handle the acid in your stomach, but if you take them in excess, they go beyond the stomach, the bicarb gets absorbed into the bloodstream, and now you've created a metabolic alkalosis due to overconsumption of your antacids. The other drugs can be alkaline as well, and so overconsumption of alkaline drugs could cause metabolic alkalosis. A sign of metabolic alkalosis is a respiratory down, ramp it down, so hypoventilation. Patient comes in hypoventilating, you want to look at their medications and see, are they on medication? Ask them, how's your Tums today? And they say, oh, I got them. And they pull out a jar of antacids, you know, they probably are over-consuming that. So compensations, you want to get the hydrogen off of any protein that it's bound to. Your body will do that. It's going to reduce the ventilatory rate. That's why it's a good sign of an alkalosis, because of the hypoventilation. So you're retaining the CO2 to try and compensate for the excess bicarb in the blood. The kidneys are going to reabsorb or take CO2, make new hydrogen out of it, put it into the blood, get rid of excess bicarb, and put it out into the urine. You can go over this table yourself. If you can go through the table and figure and tell you and discuss what's happening at each level, then you understand your acid-base balance. So use this as a review. Go over the early slides first, and then go through the table and see what's happening with uncompensated, compensated respiratory acidosis, alkalosis, metabolic acidosis, or alkalosis. So when you talk about uncompensated, that means what happens before the body does anything. Why do you have respiratory acidosis? Because you're not getting rid of enough CO2. So CO2 is, in the normal situation, you have in the plasma, not all the extracellular fluid, but in the plasma, you've got a ratio of 20 to 1 for hydrogen ion to bicarb. And in uncompensated respiratory acidosis, that ratio is now 10 bicarbs to every 1 hydrogen ion. So you've lost the bicarb. So your body has to compensate for that to get the ratio back to 20 to 1. Oops. So it's going to increase the bicarb, and it's going to get rid of renally or with ventilation, get rid of CO2 or get rid of hydrogen at the kidney. So if you can go through all these steps and understand what's happening, then you understand your acid-base balance. Okay. Reproduction.